In 1962, a mechanic in Muncie, Indiana, took in a car that two other shops had already given up on. It ran rough, it had no power, and the men before him had thrown parts at it for a week and guessed wrong every time. He did not open the hood and start pulling it apart. He reached into his toolbox for a small round gauge that cost him about $3, screwed a length of rubber hose onto a fitting on the intake manifold, started the engine, and watched a single needle for about 10 seconds. Then he shut it off and told the owner he had a burnt exhaust valve in one cylinder. And he was right, and he had known it without loosening a single bolt. His customers thought he was a magician. He was not. He was reading the one gauge that almost every mechanic of his era carried and almost no driver has ever heard of. A gauge that in the right hands could point to the cause of the great majority of engine troubles in seconds because of one simple truth about engines that we have very nearly forgotten. An engine is an AIR pump, and everything it does wrong changes the way it breathes. That gauge was a vacuum gauge, and understanding why it was so powerful means understanding what an engine actually is. When an engine runs, each piston drops down its cylinder and tries to pull in air, but the throttle at idle is nearly closed, choking off that air. So the engine is constantly trying to breathe in against a nearly shut door, and that creates a strong suction in the intake manifold, a partial vacuum measured in inches of mercury. That vacuum is the sound of the engine breathing, and a vacuum gauge is nothing more than an instrument that listens to it. A healthy engine at idle, down near sea level, pulls a steady 17 to 22 inches of mercury and holds the needle rock still. That steadiness is the whole secret, because a needle holding solid at 20 inches is telling you something remarkable, that every valve is sealing, every piston ring is holding, the ignition is firing on time, and the whole engine is breathing in clean, even, healthy pulls. Drivers of that era half understood this without knowing the diagnostics, because a great many cars of the 50s and 60s came from the factory with a vacuum gauge built right into the dashboard, sold as an economy gauge. It read the same manifold vacuum, and a driver watching it learned that a light foot, easy on the throttle, kept the needle high and the fuel bill low, while stomping the pedal dropped the vacuum and drank gasoline. So the instrument was already familiar. What the ordinary driver used to save a little gas, the mechanic in the bay used to see straight into the soul of the engine, because the very same number that told you how hard you were pressing the pedal also told a trained man whether the machine underneath was whole or failing. And the moment anything goes wrong inside that engine, the breathing changes and the needle tells on it. This is the part that made the Muncie mechanic look like a wizard, and it is not magic at all, only a language written in the movement of a needle, a language he had spent his life learning to read. Every different fault inside an engine disturbs the vacuum in its own particular way, leaves its own signature on the gauge. And a man who knew those signatures could sit and watch the needle for a few seconds and name the trouble before he ever picked up a wrench. Let me teach you to read a little of that language, the way the old man taught him, because once you see it, you understand why this $3 tool was worth more than a whole bench of others. Start with the burnt valve, the one he caught in that first car. When a valve is burnt and no longer sealing its cylinder, that cylinder loses its grip on the air each time it comes around, and the needle, sitting steady, drops sharply a few inches and then snaps back over and over in a regular rhythm, once for every time that bad cylinder fires and fails. A steady needle that dips and recovers in a regular beat is a burnt or leaking valve, almost every time, and the mechanic could even count the rhythm to know it was a single cylinder. He did not have to guess which of a dozen problems it might be. The needle told him it was a valve, and valves were where he looked. Now, a leak, the most common trouble of all. When air sneaks into the engine somewhere it should not, through a cracked hose or a failing intake gasket, the engine is pulling in unmeasured air and cannot build its proper suction, and the needle sits low and steady, well below where it should be, or in a bad leak drops down near 5 inches and floats there. A low, steady reading told him to hunt for a leak, and he had a trick for finding it, spraying a little carburetor cleaner around the hoses and gaskets while he watched the gauge, because the moment the spray got sucked through the leak, the idle changed and the needle jumped, and the leak had given itself away.
Before we go on, I made something special for you. A guide for men like us, who still believe a man should be able to keep his own car running. It's the Forgotten Mechanic's Handbook, the old-fashioned car repair secrets our grandfathers used to fix any engine and keep it running for decades. But these skills are disappearing fast, and once they're gone for good. Don't pay another mechanic ever again. Scan the QR code on screen or click the link below. Go ahead, I'll wait right here.
The needle's every motion meant something, and he knew them all. A needle that vibrated rapidly back and forth in a narrow band, 14 to 19 inches, quivering like a plucked string, meant worn valve guides, the valve stems loose in their worn sleeves. A needle that pulsed or flickered in a slow sweep of several inches meant sticking valves or valves not seating right. A reading that was low but held steady meant timing that had slipped late, or in an older engine, piston rings worn enough that the cylinders no longer sealed and held pressure. A needle that drifted and wandered slowly up and down meant the fuel mixture was off, too lean, hunting. Each fault, its own motion. Each motion, its own name. And that is the honest truth behind the striking claim in this story that one small gauge could point to the cause of the great majority of engine troubles. It is not that the gauge printed a diagnosis or named a part. It is that nearly everything that goes mechanically wrong inside a running engine, a valve that will not seal, a ring that will not hold, a leak drawing false air, a spark firing late, an exhaust that cannot clear, changes the way the engine breathes, and the breathing is exactly what the needle shows. So a man who could read it saw the fingerprint of almost every common fault 9 times out of 10, and knew instantly which family of trouble he was chasing. What the gauge could not always do alone was tell him precisely which cylinder held the burnt valve, and for that he would follow it with a compression test on the suspect cylinders to pin the culprit down. The gauge narrowed a whole engine's worth of possibilities to one kind of fault in seconds. The follow-up put a finger on the exact spot. Together they turned a mystery into a repair, and the gauge did the larger share of the work. The most dramatic reading of all was the blown head gasket, and it was unmistakable once you had seen it. When a head gasket fails between 2 cylinders or into the cooling system, the needle swings wide and wild across a huge range, 5 inches to 19 and back, with no rhythm to it at all, lurching because the engine's breathing has become chaos. A mechanic who saw that violent, aimless swinging knew before he touched anything that he was looking at a head gasket, the kind of diagnosis that could otherwise cost days of tearing down to reach. The needle handed it to him in seconds. And there were the tests he could perform by hand, working the throttle while he watched. A slow, steady drop in the reading while he held the engine at speed meant the exhaust was restricted, a clogged muffler or a crushed pipe strangling the engine's ability to breathe out. And the snap test, the quickest of all, where he would snap the throttle wide open and let it go. On a healthy engine, the needle dove towards 0 and then, on release, leapt well above its normal idle, up past 23 or 24, before settling back. the sign of strong rings sealing hard. But if the needle failed to jump up above normal on release, if it just sagged back to idle, the piston rings were worn and the engine's compression was going, and he knew the bottom end was tired without ever opening it. There were subtler signatures still, for the man patient enough to watch. Weak or broken valve springs hid at idle and revealed themselves only under speed, so he would bring the engine up to a fast, steady run and watch the needle begin to swing wider and wider as the revolutions climbed, the springs no longer snapping their valves shut fast enough to keep the breathing clean. And a head gasket that was only beginning to fail into the cooling system would give itself away slowly, the reading starting normal and then sinking inch by inch, as the engine warmed and the coolant heated and the breech opened, a slow downward drift that told him to look at the gasket before it let go for good. He had learned to give the engine time, to watch the needle through a cold start into a full warm-up, because some troubles only spoke once the machine was hot and working, and a hasty man reading for 5 seconds would miss what a patient man reading for 2 minutes would catch. Here is the part of his story worth telling, because a tool is only as good as the hand that holds it. The Muncie mechanic did not invent his skill. He learned it as a boy from the old man who ran the garage before him, who kept a vacuum gauge in his shirt pocket the way other men kept a pencil, and who believed that a mechanic who could not read an engine's breathing was not yet a mechanic at all. For 2 years, the old man made him hook the gauge to every engine that came in, healthy or sick, and say aloud what the needle was doing and what it meant before he was allowed to fix anything. "Watch the needle," he would say. "The engine is telling you what is wrong with it. You have only to learn its language." And slowly the boy did, until the day a car came in that stumped the old man for a moment, and the boy, watching the needle drop in its regular beat, said quietly that it was a burnt valve, and the old man checked, and the boy was right, and after that he was trusted with the gouge alone. There was a traveling salesman who came through Muncie twice a year and would trust no other shop with his car because of a single afternoon years before. He had rolled in with an engine that surged and hunted and would not idle, and had been told by a big city garage that it needed a complete overhaul he could not afford. The Muncie mechanic hooked up his gauge, watched the needle drift and wander in the slow sweep of a lean mixture, put his hands to the carburetor and the intake, found a cracked hose drawing air, and fixed it in 20 minutes for the price of a hose. The salesman drove that car 4 more years. He told the story up and down his route, and it was always the same story people told about that garage, that the man there could find in a few minutes with a little gauge what other shops could not find in a week with the whole car in pieces on the floor. Understand what that gauge saved a man, and the title's promise stops sounding like a boast. Without it, a mechanic faced with a rough-running engine was half blind. He guessed. He replaced a part, and if the trouble stayed, he replaced another, and the bill climbed with every wrong guess, while the real fault hid. That is exactly how the 2 shops before him had burned a week and the owner's money on that first car. The vacuum gauge ended the guessing. It pointed him, in seconds, at the kind of fault and the place to look, so he replaced the right part the first time and sent the car home fixed. A $3 tool that stops a man from throwing hundreds of dollars of wrong parts at an engine and from charging a customer for days of labor spent chasing the wrong thing was worth more than its weight in gold, and it saved the driver the far larger bill that comes from a misdiagnosis chased all the way to a needless engine rebuild. Think about how the guessing actually goes, because it is the same trap in every era. A car runs rough. The man without the gauge replaces the spark plugs because that is cheap and easy, and the car still runs rough. So he replaces the ignition points, then the carburetor is rebuilt, then a coil, each guess reasonable on its own, each one billed, and all the while the real fault, a single burnt valve, sits untouched because nothing he has done could ever have reached it. Weeks pass, and hundreds of dollars leave the customer's pocket, and in the end, the engine still runs rough, and often enough the frustrated shop finally recommends a rebuild the car never needed. The man with the gauge skipped every step of that. He read a valve in 10 seconds and went straight to it. The $3 was never the point. The point was everything the $3 kept him from wasting. There were things you had to know to read it true, and he knew them all, and they are worth saying so you do not fool yourself. You had to take the reading from manifold vacuum, from a port below the throttle plate that sees the true suction of the engine, not from a ported source above it that behaves differently and will lie to you. You had to let the engine come fully up to temperature first, because a cold engine gives false, erratic readings. You had to know your altitude because vacuum drops about 1 inch of mercury for every 1,000 feet you climb above the sea, so an engine that reads 20 inches at the coast might read only 15 in the mountains and be perfectly healthy. And you had to know that some engines, built with wild performance camshafts, idle rough and low by their nature and always would. The gauge did not think for you. It gave you the truth of the breathing, and you supplied the judgment. In its day, this was not an exotic skill, but a standard one, taught in every trade school and printed in every shop manual. A proper tune-up in 1962 very often began with the vacuum gauge, because before a man adjusted the timing or set the carburetor, he wanted to know what the engine's breathing looked like, so he could tell whether he was tuning a healthy engine or chasing a mechanical fault that no adjustment would ever cure. The gauge kept him honest. It stopped him from spending an hour perfecting the idle mixture on an engine whose real problem was a valve that would never seal, no matter how the carburetor was set. It told him, first, whether the patient was well enough to tune at all, and that single habit, checking the breathing before touching the adjustments, separated the mechanics who fixed cars from the ones who only fiddled with them. If any of this makes you want to understand what is actually happening inside your own engine, rather than standing helpless in front of it, that instinct is exactly the one worth feeding. Hit that subscribe button, because this is the kind of knowledge this whole channel exists to keep alive. Now the honest reckoning with today, because your modern car is not that 1962 engine, and the mechanic would tell you so plainly. The vacuum gauge has faded for a real reason, not a foolish one. Modern cars carry an onboard computer and a network of sensors, and a technician today plugs in a scan tool that reads those sensors directly, counts misfires by cylinder, and reports the mixture and the timing without anyone watching a needle. For much of modern diagnosis, that scanner is faster and more precise than the old gauge, and it can see electronic faults the gauge never could. On many modern engines, there is no longer an easy manifold port to tap, and on a turbocharged engine, which spends much of its life under boost rather than vacuum, the old readings do not apply the same way at all. But do not mistake the gauge for useless, because that would be its own error. On any ordinary engine that still breathes against a throttle, and that is a great many of them, the vacuum gauge still reads the pure mechanical health of the thing in a way a scan tool does not directly show you. A scanner will tell you a cylinder is misfiring. The vacuum gauge can tell you why, whether that misfire is a burnt valve or a leak or worn rings, because it is watching the actual breathing and not just reading a code. That distinction matters more than it sounds. A single misfire code can spring from a bad plug, a weak coil, a clogged injector, a vacuum leak, a burnt valve, or a tired ring. and a technician who only reads the code can still end up guessing among them, replacing the cheap electronic parts first and working outward, the same old spiral in a modern coat. The gauge cuts across that. If the electronics all check out and the needle is dropping in that steady telltale beat, the trouble is mechanical. It is a valve, and no amount of new coils and plugs will ever touch it. The old tool and the new one are strongest together, the scanner reading the nerves of the engine and the gauge reading its breath, and the mechanic who can read both is closer to the truth than one who trusts either alone. In the hands of someone who understands engines, it remains one of the cheapest and most revealing tools you can own. A direct window onto whether the valves seal and the rings hold and the engine breathes clean, which are the deepest truths about any engine and the ones the computer only ever infers. It did not stop working. We simply stopped learning to read it. And you can still hold that window in your own hands for very little. A vacuum gauge that cost $3 in 1962 costs perhaps $15 or $20 today, sold in any parts store, and on an ordinary engine you use it exactly the way the Muncie mechanic did. You find a manifold vacuum port below the throttle, or tap into the line that feeds the brake booster, connect the gauge, warm the engine fully, and watch the needle at idle, steady and high, and the engine is breathing well. Low, drifting, dropping in a beat, or swinging wild, and the engine is telling you which family of trouble it hides before you have spent $1 on a part or an hour on a guess. It will not read a fault in the electronics, and it is a companion to the scan tool rather than a replacement for it. But for the pure mechanical health of an engine, it remains, 60 years on, one of the most honest few dollars a person can spend. It is worth sitting for a moment with what kind of knowledge this was, because it is a kind we are losing everywhere, not only under the hood. It was not information you could look up. It was a trained perception, built slowly, by watching the same needle on 1,000 engines until the meaning of its every tremble became as plain to the eye as a word on a page. No screen could hand it to you, and no manual could fully teach it, because the last of it lived in the pattern reading of an experienced eye, the way a farmer reads weather or a doctor reads a face. That is the most fragile kind of knowledge there is, the kind that must be passed from one pair of hands to the next in the doing. And it is exactly the kind that vanishes the instant a generation decides a machine can do the reading for them. None of this was ever magic, and that is the quiet tragedy of losing it. It was a $3 gauge and a man who had learned that an engine is an air pump, and that a machine breathing wrong will always show you exactly how, if you know how to look. The Muncie mechanic could read an engine's whole condition off a trembling needle the way a doctor reads a heartbeat, and he could do it in seconds, on a bench that held nothing else so cheap or so wise. The knowledge lived in his eyes and his hands, in 10,000 needles watched until their language became plain, and that kind of knowledge is the easiest of all to lose, because it was never written in a part number or a menu on a screen. We did not abandon the vacuum gauge because engines stopped breathing. Every engine that pulls air past a throttle is still telling the same story on the same needle it told in 1962, still confessing its burnt valves and its worn rings and its hidden leaks to anyone who cares to listen. We abandoned it because a screen came along that would do part of the reading for us, and we were glad to stop learning the hard language ourselves. The computer will read the codes. It will never do what he did, which was to look at a machine and understand it all the way down from the way it drew its breath. The old man in Muncie kept his vacuum gauge until the day he closed the garage for good, and on that last afternoon he took it out of his shirt pocket, screwed the little hose onto it one more time, and set it in the hands of the young man taking his tools. "Watch the needle," he said. "The engine will always tell you what is wrong with it. You have only to be the last kind of man who still knows how to listen." Then he started the engine one final time, and the two of them stood there in the quiet, watching the needle hold steady and true, a healthy engine breathing easy, saying nothing was wrong at all.